Harvard Medical School and did my residency at Harvard. And one day a week in my residency, I worked at a state prison in Massachusetts called the Norfolk Prison. It was a famous prison because it's where Malcolm X served 6 years on a burglary charge. He went in as Detroit Red and he came out as Malcolm X. So he's the most famous graduate of the Norfolk Prison. But I just was fascinated by the people who were in prison. I was fascinated by prisons as a culture. The stories of the prisoners were stories I'd never heard before in my life. And I was interested in those people. So when it came time for me to get my first job at the age of 32 that was outside of my training, I had what you could call a calling. And that was, I wanted to help those people who were in prison with medical knowledge. And honestly, I had no idea what that would be. I didn't need to know what it would be. I just knew that I wanted to do that. And so I looked around at a number of different corrections departments, and I settled on the District of Columbia Department of Corrections because it's in the spotlight in the nation's capital. And because it was experiencing a crime epidemic in 1968, which was the year that I'm describing, Richard Nixon was running for presidency, and he called Washington, D.C. the crime capital of the nation. So there was public attention to crime in district that attracted me to get there too. And so I went to work in the D.C. Department of Corrections just full time. They never had anybody like that do that. They didn't know what they were going to do with me either. In very quick order, I became the head of community corrections, including running the parole system there, which is kind of surprising, but I did. The question was, why is this a crime epidemic? What is that's going on? And so in August of 1969, I got half a dozen college students out for the summer and did urine tests on everybody coming into DC jail for a month. And we identified that 44% of them tested positive for heroin. And when we plotted the year they first used heroin against the crime rate in the city, they matched. Same slope, same direction. And this was published in the New England Journal of Medicine and Science Magazine. It was a big deal because it documented the relationship between the heroin and crime. At that point, the question for me is, okay, you've made this connection, what do you do about it? And so I looked around at treatment, what was going on. At the time, what appeared to me to be the dominant treatments were therapeutic communities and methadone. And so I got to know the people who were leading both of those movements. In methadone, it was Vincent Dole and Marie Neiswanger. And they started that in New York City in 1964. And it was clear to me that the only treatment that could be deployed in a scale to the size of the epidemic was methadone. So I became very interested in that and started the first methadone program in September of '69. And on February 12th of 1970, in other words, 4 months later, the mayor appointed me head of a newly created Narcotics Treatment Administration to provide treatment for all the heroin addicts in Washington. In the next 3 years, we treated 15,000 heroin addicts in 20 centers, published 200 papers as a result of that. It was a very influential public health movement. The heroin overdoses went from 70 a year to 4 in a year. The crime rate on a monthly basis was cut in half. It was a dramatic showing of massive treatment having an effect on crime and death. In 1973, I was appointed to the White House as a drug czar for Richard Nixon. I'd gotten to know the people in the White House at that point. And at 37, the first director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse. So it was a pretty meteoric career of a guy who doesn't know where he's going. But it all had to do with heroin and the use of treatment for public health and public safety reasons. And I was head of NIDA for 5 years and White House drug czar for 3 years. And then I left the government in '78 and went out and continued. I'd always had my own practice of psychiatry in the evenings, and I got very interested in another problem, and that was anxiety. And so I got involved with what became the anxiety disorders field and founded the Anxiety Disorders Association of America, which is the largest group dealing with that problem. And I had a whole life that people didn't know anything about my drug life and my anxiety life, but they were two different areas. But over time, I migrated back to the drug issue through a nonprofit organization called the Institute for Behavior and Health that identifies big new ideas that can reduce the problem of drugs in the country. And that's what I do now. And I'm professor of psychiatry, clinical professor of psychiatry at Georgetown Medical School. And you know, I would say, well, what's my biggest discovery in that? What has really grabbed me? And I think that by far the most dramatic change is the recognition of the recovery movement, of recovery in my patients. When I started, I thought, well, you know, you're a heroin addict and then you stop using heroin and then you're done. That's the end of that. I didn't really think about, well, what happens then? And I didn't think much beyond not using heroin as a goal. I had an ex-addict advisory board that was wonderful. I really loved these guys. And 15 years later, after I'd left, 20 years later, I went to the retirement party of a fellow named Nat Turner. And I asked him about, you know, where are the guys? You know, what's happened to everybody? And he said, they're all dead. And they were all his age, which wasn't old, it was my age really, or younger. And I said, well, what happened to them? Every one of them had died of alcoholism. And I said, well, how come you're alive and they're dead? And he said, I went to meetings and they didn't. He went to AA and they didn't. Well, that kind of experience I repeated in my practice, where I saw the power of the 12-step programs, which I'd completely overlooked earlier in my career, and became very interested in that. And then that led me to think about, and I noticed that drug treatment, primarily, almost always, results in relapse. People, I don't care how good the treatment is, I don't care whether it's medication or drug-free, people come out and they go back to drugs. And so the question was, how could you make recovery instead of relapse the expected outcome of treatment? That's the question. And so the answer to that was, in my practice, I had seen many physicians who were under the Physicians' Health Programs, and so with Tom McClellan and Greg Skipper, we did the first national study of the Physicians' Health Programs and discovered that the way to promote recovery in long term is not in the treatment, it's the monitoring with the consequences after you leave the treatment and getting the people involved in the 12 steps, the AA and NA, so that they can carry that on, because that goes on forever. The treatment is always short. So you've got a short-term treatment and a long-term problem. This is not smart in terms of a health intervention. So what I've become very interested in now is how to bring that knowledge to the treatment field generally, and to change that lamentable relationship of relapse as the outcome of treatment. And I would say that's sort of become my mission to do that. And I do it in a lot of areas. I mean, I'm interested in drug driving, for example. I'm interested in prescription drug abuse. I'm interested in prevention. And of course, I'm interested in treatment. So in all those areas, we've developed ideas that we want to promote at IBH. And I see myself as a kind of missionary, carrying these ideas around and encouraging their adoption. And none of the ideas came from me. I identified them and then promoted them. But I don't own them. I don't have a financial interest in any of them. I want to give them away. You know, they say in AA, pass it on. I want to pass it on to whoever will listen. And that's why this meeting, the RX Summit, is so important, because this is a turning point in history, and it's a great idea marketplace. Now, I was right there in the center of all that, and you know, the politics have become very much more, what shall I say, political, ideological. They weren't really ideological in those days. So Nixon was in the White House. He came in January 20th of '69, and he had this heroin epidemic. Nixon had no preconceived ideas about what to do. He wanted to get the best people he could. His first drug czar was Jerome Jaffe. Jerry Jaffe, I'm the second drug czar. Both of us are Democrats. That didn't bother Nixon at all. And people talk about the drug war. What Nixon did was fund treatment in a higher level and percentage than ever happened again. He really committed to the whole treatment approach to drugs, and it's amazing to me how people can't imagine that now, that was the Nixon administration, but it was. And one of the things that I did that was really important, because I was using methadone, I validated the use of methadone, which was then an investigational drug, and got the FDA to approve it generally in '74. So I was right there, all those things that happened at that time. But that's absolutely true, that people do not understand. The other thing is that I'm the only person who's known all 15 drug czars. So I personally connected with all of them. And we've got a lot of presidents, and people say, well, they like this president, but they don't like that president, and they get very upset about things, and they get mad about their drug. The thing that's striking about this is the similarities of the presidents. I don't see the effect of ideology on that. Reagan was very supportive of treatment, for example, very supportive of prevention. I mean, the whole parents movement was related to the Reagan administration. So I'm not into this guy's good and that guy's bad. I think they've all wrestled with a tough problem. They've done the best they could with it. This guy we got now, Barack Obama, he's done his wrestling with it. A lot of things he's done are great. I'm not so thrilled about some of the things he's done, but basically he's great. And I think that his first drug czar with Gil Kirilakowski, he was a fabulous guy, and his new drug czar is Michael Botticelli, and he's a fabulous guy. So I think they're all good. I don't vilify any of them. When Nixon established this commitment to treatment, one of the things that was part of that was the creation of NIDA and the White House Drug Office. He created the first White House Drug Office. That bill passed Congress in 1973 72, without a single dissenting vote in either Congress or the Senate. That is a model for bipartisanship. And you see something like that happening again around the heroin problem, which I think is really quite neat. I'm all for that. Well, I'm pretty well aware that medication-assisted treatment is no silver bullet. And I think that there's a tremendous likelihood of overestimating the value of medicine. The big problems with, there's three of them. Methadone, which is where we started, and then we have buprenorphine, and then we have naltrexone. And they have brand names for the things that they're doing, but those are the chemicals. Those were all known and studied when I was head of NIDA. I mean, if people talk about the great progress we've made in science, well, let's think about that a little bit, because that was 40 years ago. But anyhow, the problem with the medication-assisted treatment is, number one, many people on MAT, as it's called, are continuing to use alcohol and drugs while they're on the medication. This is a problem in a drug treatment, and they call it evidence-based treatment. The evidence-based is they're better off when they're on than they are when they're off. That's the FDA standard, a 20% or more reduction in the target symptom, and you've got FDA approval for efficacy in it. Well, they certainly deliver that. In other words, when you're taking the methadone, when you're taking the naltrexone, when you're taking the buprenorphine, you're less likely to die of an overdose. you're less likely to use intravenous injections to get infections with HIV or Hep C than you are when you're off. You're less likely to commit crimes. It's all true. That's right. The problem is that they are continuing to use, and people don't stay very long. Most of them do not. So you get with buprenorphine and naltrexone, the average stay is 3 to 6 months for a lifetime disease. For methadone, it's 6 to 12 months. Some stay longer, there's no doubt about that, especially on methadone, but it's a small percentage of the total. Most of them leave quite quickly. And when they leave MAT, they're no better off than they were when they went in. The presumption is they're all going to relapse to opiates when they leave, because Dole's model was they're going to stay forever. I understand that model. The fact is they don't stay forever. And then the question is, well, what happens to them? So, and the third problem with MAT is both buprenorphine and methadone have a street value. They're diverted. They're sold by the patients on the street. That's not very attractive in terms of a treatment. So that's it. But they do attract patients into treatment, and that's good about that. What I would like to have MAT do is, first of all, set a drug-free standard. Now, people will say, critics of MAT say, if you're taking buprenorphine and you're taking methadone, you're still a drug addict and can't be in recovery. Well, that's not my view. If you're taking methadone or buprenorphine in fully compliance with the prescription, you're not selling it, you're not using anything else, you're not taking more, you're not injecting it, then you can be called in recovery, as far as I'm concerned. That's the use of a medicine. That's not the use of a drug. A drug is something you take for yourself. You don't have a doctor involved in it. Now, some people in the recovery movement don't agree with me about that, and so they will just write off all these people. Well, I think part of the reason they write them off is because they see such discouraging outcomes when the patients leave the MAT. But in any event, that's what I think. And I think the question is, how good is MAT and how good are the drug-free programs at producing long-term recovery, 5-year recovery? That's the key question. And that standard should be applied to all treatment, medication and no medication. And let's see how everybody does. Now, what the physicians' health programs tell us is that the way to improve that is not by improving the treatment, it's by improving the monitoring with consequences after they leave treatment. So the solution to the problem is not necessarily to improve the treatment, because it's so short in relationship to the duration of the problem. And I don't think you're going to find what the physicians' health programs do is, one is the monitoring consequences, and the other is immerse them in AA and NA. Now, when you go to AA and NA and the 12-step fellowships, that goes on forever. And we've done a study of follow-up the people 5 years after the last mandatory monitoring. 5 years after the last mandatory monitoring, 96% of them are in recovery. That's sustained recovery. That's what you want from all treatment. And the question is, how do you get there with more than a small percentage of your patients? Well, they don't object to you taking, for example, Prozac. They have a problem with you taking a controlled substance. So they don't like the benzodiazepines, they don't like other opiates, and they don't like alcohol. So it's the controlled substances plus alcohol that they really are down on. Absolutely, and I think a lot of that comes from their experience, which is often not very positive. But there's something really big that's happening in the field right now. There's been these camps. There's MAT and there's drug-free, and they war. There's a long history of drug treatments warring against each other, and of course that just ruins the reputation of both of them when they do that. It's a terrible fratricidal war that is unproductive, but it's been going on for a long time. But there's something new, a new breeze blowing, and that is from Hazelden. Hazelden was the fount of the drug-free model, the 28-day, and I need to say what that treatment is, because it's really important. AA had been around since 1935, so 20 years later, 1955, comes a new idea, and that is to take AA into a medical treatment. So it becomes part of the medical treatment, and with doctors and nurses, and AA never had professionals in it. It was a self-help group of the people who are in the program themselves. No license, none of that stuff. So now you got a program, and it had 28 days of residential care. And the reason it was 28 days was because in Minnesota at that time, that's what the health insurance was required to provide. It wasn't a clinical decision, it was just a monetary decision of who they could get to come. And so they did 28 days. But what they did after that was, after you leave a Minnesota model program, you are admonished to go to meetings for the rest of your life. So what they do is they educate the patient to the disease concept of addiction. Bill Wilson said, you can drink, you're fine, but we can't drink, because when we drink, we lose control. So he called it, because there was a lot of interest in allergies at that time, we call it an allergy. So our allergies, we can't do it. So we don't want to, it wasn't like prohibition. We don't want to stop you from drinking. You're a normal drinker, but I'm not a normal drinker because I have this allergy and I can't drink. So they educate them about that, but it's not just alcohol, it's marijuana and other drugs, and that's the AA model. Okay, and NA. And then you go out from the program and go to those meetings, and that sustains you in recovery. And when people relapse, and people do relapse, they come back into the program. They're not likely to relapse while they're still going to meetings, but the typical thing they do, they stop going to meetings, and then they relapse, and then they come back into the program and go along with it from then. And that's a very effective model. The problem is, when you send somebody out and tell them, well, this is what you need to do, once the person's life is stabilized, they lose that sense of vulnerability, and they think, well, they can drink again, or they can use a little bit of drugs. And that's very seductive to getting them back into the whole cycle of the thing. But that was the model. Now what's happened new is at Hazleton, a group of people led by a physician, Marv Seppala, have said, wait a minute, because we've got these young opiate addicts, and they're dropping out very quickly from the treatment, and there are a lot of dying of overdoses, we're going to bring medication into Hazleton. So they brought in buprenorphine and naltrexone. And they said to everybody, now mind you, this is a residential drug-free program. So everybody's in there has committed themselves to not using drugs and alcohol, but they are then offered medication assist to the treatment, either buprenorphine or naltrexone, okay? What's very interesting is about 40% of the people choose naltrexone. About 20% choose buprenorphine, and 40% don't use it either. And they're all in the same program with the same counselors. And everybody said you couldn't do that, but they're doing it, and they're getting along, and the patients get along with each other, and they can see what the other guys are doing or gals are doing. And that is so neat, that is so wonderful. Because they're, unlike the typical MAT, where they don't give a darn whether you use drugs or don't use drugs, except admonish you about it. They really take it very seriously about it with drug testing and all the rest of it. So I'm excited about that, because I think that breaks us out of the sort of war that has been going on. The question's going to be, and I'm very interested in this, and I don't know the answer to this, they don't know the answer to this now, is one of those three groups, the no medication, the buprenorphine or the naltrexone, better able to produce long-term recovery than the others? That's the question. And I think a lot of people on the drug-free side would say, well, the people, especially the ones on buprenorphine, are going to have trouble coming off of the buprenorphine, and although it looks easier at the start, at the end, it may be not like that. So let's just see where, but they don't try to get them off. They're not, if you want to stay on buprenorphine at Hazleton forever, that's okay. They're not saying you got 1 year and you have to get off. No, as long as you're drug-free and you want to do it, you can continue on. And the same thing with the naltrexone. Now the reality is going to be they're going to want to stop, a lot of them, almost all of them, I think are going to want to stop the medication, and then we'll see. where they are. But see how different these people are, because all those hazelnut people are inculcated into AA and NA. So they will have that when they come out. So they're not going to look like the people coming out of MAT. The people coming out of MAT don't have anything when they come out. I'm not a real big fan of medication for alcoholism, but I do use it. And I've had several patients who have done very well with a camprosate or naltrexone for alcohol. And that's fine with me. I'm happy to do that. I really think, though, that most of it has to just go to meetings, work the program, get a sponsor, and usually that takes care of it for most people. Hey, some people won't go to meetings, then you can try that. There's an assumption that's even worse than that, and that is that what we need to do is refer to treatment, as if that was going to solve the problem. 95% of addicted people do not think they have a problem and don't want any treatment. So referring somebody to treatment who doesn't think he needs it is not likely to have a good outcome. There's a fantasy that somehow the addicts are dying for treatment that is really just bizarre for anybody who's in the field to realize that. My favorite statistic is that addicts right now are paying more money to get drugs than all the drug treatment put together costs. So the addicts don't need health insurance. They don't need anybody helping them. They don't have to save their money. They just spend the money that they spend on drugs, on treatment, and it would all be funded. But they're not doing that. And what they do with their money is telling you what their motivation is. The motivation is to use drugs. It's not to get clean. The addiction is an enslavement. It's a kind of slavery. And it's like an abusive love affair. Somebody comes in and they got an abusive lover, and once they get cleaned up and fix the broken arm and whatever else is going on, they'll go back to that lover, and they think each time, well, next time it'll be different. And so what you do as a therapist is you say, no, next time you're just going to get beat up worse than you did the last time. And at some point, the person says, they surrender. They said, I've had enough. And so when I see patients and they tell me they don't want to go to meetings and they don't want to take the medicine and all this kind of stuff, they're just fine, I say, that's good. Now, I've completed that stage of my research. I know the answer for me when I think about you, and that is you need to be in the treatment. But you haven't seen that, so you got to do more research. And I'm going to tell you something about what you're going to find when you do this research. You will continue to suffer until you've had enough. And the only thing that'll stop that, other than getting well and not using, is death. If you die first, yes, that's the end of the game. But otherwise, you will keep suffering, and the suffering will increase, not decrease, over time. But you go out and go until you are ready to quit, because you have to say, I give up, I surrender. It's very sad to see people go out and do that, but that's what they do. And the question I would have for him is that is that on the road to recovery, or is that a separate road, not going to recovery? And I think that's what we need to learn more about. I think for a few people it is the road to recovery, but my experience is not very many. I think he's right that while they're on, and people use the term harm reduction. They say, they want to, give addicts needles, and get needle exchange kind of programs, so they can be less likely to get intravenous infections. They want to give them a safe place to shoot heroin. The recent program on PBS, Frontline, glorified a police program in Seattle, where the police officers identify the heroin addicts and essentially help them survive while they're using heroin until they're ready to come into treatment. And so we watched on this program, month after month, of people stealing, selling drugs. The police did nothing except, offering, I'll take you to treatment when you're ready. The sort of heroine of their program did get into recovery for, at least she was drug-free for, I think, 2 months, something like that. How did she get there? She had such terrible lung infections as a result of her addiction that she had 2 consecutive surgeries on her lungs that were so devastating to her. That was her bottom. And then she did go into treatment. But it's no thanks to the police, And from my point of view, it's horrifying to see police enabling intravenous heroin use when the person is living on the street. The women were prostituting themselves. They were selling drugs. They were stealing. They said this on the television. They say this to the police officer there. They're stealing. They're selling drugs, and the police officers do nothing. I just think, and they encourage the families to do that. So they had a father who was just waiting for his daughter. Well, that was the daughter who had the surgeries, and he was rewarded for his waiting. I don't think it's good for parents to just wait. I want them to intervene. I want them to do something. I want the police to do something. You know, it's kind of like you build it and then they'll come. I don't know that that's true. The other thing is that most of the people are in there because somebody got a baseball bat and hit them on the head. Whether it was the cops, the judge, the employer, the parents, the husband or the wife, somebody, if somebody comes in voluntarily, there's somebody else who's got a baseball bat to that guy's or that gal's head. You can look and see what it is because they are not going to come in on their own. I have a friend who runs an outpatient program in Washington, the biggest program in the Washington-Baltimore area, so it's a very multi-center outpatient substance abuse program. It's called COMAC, and George Kalodner's the guy's name. Well, he's a wonderful person. He says that everybody who comes in his door has been to AA and NA and has concluded it doesn't work for them. So if he advertised to people, you come here and we're going to connect you to AA and NA and you're going to go there for the rest of your life, he'd have no patience. He'd have no patience. So it's a kind of seduction that he has to have. You know, we're a medical program. Yes, people do go to AA, but we don't require people to go to AA, and we'll see what's best for you. He also uses buprenorphine in the program to show that he isn't just a funnel into AA. But once you're in there, you're going to get a pretty heavy dose of exposure to that. And I was involved in he has a foundation that is funded by former patients, and his purpose of the foundation is to give scholarships for people to go into treatment. And all the people from his program who are on the board are in recovery and going to meetings. Well, you reduce the voluntary nature of it. You have some kind of a consequence that gets people to stay there against their worst judgment. That's what the PHPs do. The PHPs, all those doctors hated it. They were all mad to come in, and when they come out, they're all grateful. But you've got to get that transition to get into the recovery, and it's not easy to make that sale. I kind of like the idea if a parent couldn't get a teenager to stop using drugs, that they would be able to take him to a court and say, I need the help of the law to get Charlie to stay here, and have the sanction of spending a few days in jail. So Charlie would do it. Now, you'd have to have some kind of system that would establish that Charlie really did have a drug problem. But gosh, a lot of parents have real serious problems with their kids, and they don't have any way to do that. And when they say they throw them out of the house, which is the sort of the tough love way to do it, the problem with that is they're afraid the kids are going to die. And that's not an unreasonable fear on the part. So the parents are kind of blackmailed into enabling and perpetuating or tolerating the continued drug use. We need to find some way to empower families to get kids into treatment and keep them in treatment. And you know, we're not there now. A lot of kids do get in treatment, but the problem is, especially the young ones, have even higher relapse rates than the older ones do. Well, he could do all kinds of things. He could earn his way out of that too by having some long-term sobriety. But you've got to be able to have a credible baseball bat, and unless you're prepared to swing the bat, I don't think your credibility is going to be very good. And I don't know how to do that. I don't know where that is. With physicians, it's their license. That's really, with the criminal justice system, it's jail. So what you want to do is pick the high-risk people, the ones who are really a problem, and set them in a system like 24/7 and hope probation and drug courts, which say you've got to stay clean or you go to jail. But those are people already convicted. That's a different issue. You're talking about kids who don't have any record. And how to do that in a way, I don't really know. Some sort of civil proceedings, but it would have to have something serious associated with it. And people who say, well, they don't want to do that, they just want to do it voluntarily. I understand that, and it does work voluntarily for a lot of people. It's not that nobody, but there are a whole lot of people it doesn't work for. And I think we need as a society to recognize just how powerful drug reward is and how difficult it is to resist that biology. You know, I like the rat and the fact that rats all get addicted to drugs. They don't have to be poor rats, they don't have to be black rats, they don't have to be rich rats, they don't have to be mentally ill rats. They'll all get addicted to drugs, and they'll work harder for the drugs than anything else, harder than for sex or food or anything else, because it's more stimulation there. That's the biology we're talking about. And people who don't understand that biology think that, well, there's just a small segment of the population that are vulnerable to the problem. No, it's really everybody. Yes, there are genetic differences, and some people are more vulnerable than others. A lot of that vulnerability, by the way, is behavioral rather than genetic. But even with the genetic variability, everybody's vulnerable. The peer group normalizes the drug use for the novice, what happens typically, the novices don't see people who are end-stage addicts. They see the other people who recently started and are beginning on this journey, and so they see it as benign. I have loved every minute of my career in addiction. It has been a joy every step of the way. I've had plenty of disappointments. I've been with people to deal with a lot of very tough stuff, very hard stuff. But the book I wrote, The Selfish Brain, the subtitle was Learning from Addiction. And I'm convinced that individuals learn from addiction, families learn from addiction, communities, nations, the world learns from addiction. And it's a cruel, unforgiving teacher, but the lessons are really important about what's really important to each person, about how we're important to each other, about the joys of recovery. All of these things are part of this experience and have been an absolute pleasure. The other thing is that it's always, people say, well, you've seen this so many times. I never saw a single patient that was like some other patient. Everybody is absolutely unique. And one of the things that I love about being a psychiatrist is being able to hear people's stories. Every story is not just unique, it's fascinating. It isn't just the happy stories, it's the sad stories, it's all the stories. And one of the nicest gifts any human being can give any other human being is to listen to them. And so I would like to end this with a thank you to you for listening to me. You have given me a great gift, and I am very glad if it's useful to you, and if it can be useful to other people, that would make me even happier about this opportunity for me to talk about myself.